it's good time to perhaps talk about kind of identifying and measuring, be it, ESG, being impact, be, what is it that you focus on, especially even on the engagement side, which, is something so long term.
So we've been thinking about this for a long time. And I think the easy measurement is to measure financial returns. And that we can show now correlation. But we are not quite comfortable with financial returns because we think there are other things that you should be measuring. And that's you mentioned at the beginning that I'm part of IIRC, which is the integrated reporting council. Yes. So what's that trying to do? That's trying to say that we should have much more integrated reports and accounts for companies that go beyond simply the financials. So yes, the financials are the easy way to measure the efficacy of ESG, but to us, it's not good enough. It needs to go further. And we don't know the answer. We're working on it. I mean, where we differ from others is others say to you, this is what we do. What I say to you is we spend a huge amount of time and effort and thought in trying to develop what the market thinks. I mean, we treat it almost like an academic exercise, right? And we're constantly not satisfied, and we're constantly trying to innovate and come up with a better understanding, not a better product, that's just selling, but a better understanding of how the system works. So we want to try to measure holistic return, and we're working on that. But we think it is something to do with long-term return and the impact on the wider community of where your investment is. In terms of what makes ESG, can I say that this is good governance or this is bad governance or this is good sustainability or this is bad sustainability? Kind of, but it's very nuanced. And people miss the nuance. Now, in normal investment speak, if we're just doing a normal investment in a normal company, it is not controversial to say, yeah, I mean, growth is growth, but there is a nuance of understanding where the growth comes from. When we talk about ESG factors, however, it seems like the market wants to have a specific box that they want to put everything into it rather than the nuance. And I think that that is not exactly useful, because it's the nuance of the differentiation of what sustainability means, what governance means, and how it can change over time that actually adds value in reality. So it becomes more ephemeral. It's like it ultimately manifests itself in culture. Mm-hmm. Right? And the culture is the hardest to measure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you mentioned the IIRC, and I think that you mentioned at one point in a recent video that you did on the importance of this single standard, for reporting. I just want to double check with you, perhaps, what is that would make it happen that we can achieve this single standard?
That is an interesting one. So if you go, I mean, I did history, so I always do history, right? Mm-hmm. If you go to why we have GAAP accounting, because there wasn't a standard of accounting, and the 30s crash happened.
Yes.
Crash happened, and this Companies Act was passed in the UK, and a similar act was passed in the States. What did it aim to do? To give investors a reflection of what's really happening financially in the company. That's how GAAP started. Now, by and large, in this modern era, we can get that from accounts. But actually what moves companies is not just the financials, partly because there's a lot of intangible assets in some of the biggest companies. I mean, think about the technology companies as an example. Think about even companies such as our own, where a lot of the intangible assets is in the brand and the reputation, right? So how do you measure the non-financial aspects that matter as much for the financial results as, and the whole thing, you mentioned I'm on the Banking Standards Board, the BSB. That's talking about culture in banks. Now, culture in banks mattered because culture in banks was identified as one of the reasons that the banks behaved in a way that caused the ruckus of 2008.
Yeah, not all fair, yeah.
So how do you measure it? And clearly it's as important, if not more important, than financials. And I think there is a growing agreement and understanding among the investment community that these other items have to be looked at. The key is to get to a consensus where we move and say we want integrated reporting rather than just simply financial reporting. And we in Federated Hermes UK have been doing that for some time, and we've been improving our integrated reports and accounts, and we're trying to talk about culture, and we're trying to talk about impact and about us as a company, because what is our business? I started off by saying our business is a people business. Well, okay, you can look at the financials, but that doesn't tell you where the risk and the reward is going to be. That's much more in other things that we do.
Yeah. And how far are we, do you think, of achieving something that?
So we're still some way off. I mean, I think we're coming closer in that the consensus is growing, but that takes time. But I think
any particular blockers or any particular things that would help?
I think two blockers. The one is to agree one way of doing it, because people like to have one way of doing it. If you go back to the Companies Act, that was an act of government, so people had to do it. So if the regulator comes in and says you've got to do this, that removes a block of people doing it voluntarily. And the other one is to come at a standard. I'm less concerned about the standard. People really get worried about it because you have more than one gap, right? You have UK gap and US gap. When I started, it was even more varied than it is now. It's coming closer together. So as long as there's at least within a region an agreement of what such reports should include.
1, 2. Okay. And I guess, the EU is kind of helping and somehow, putting us ahead in Europe, at least, right?
So the EU seems to be accelerating a trend much more than anywhere else in the world, both in integrating responsibility and in pushing towards this concept in accounting, which is slightly more different, because I think they think it's quite rightly a better way of understanding business.
Yes. And we have still quite a few actually questions that I wanted to ask you, but I'm conscious of time as well, for you, for ourselves, and for the listeners. And I may actually mention that in this case, I may break this one in a couple of different episodes so that people get the chance to enjoy it in shorter versions. But very quickly, talking now about perhaps reporting at the company level, which sometimes we don't talk about too much. And we were at that event on the summer, which was the Real Impact Tracker event, the soiree, and you, for those that do not know, and for self-disclaiming, Real Impact Tracker, we are partners with them, and with Kari Kosinski as one of the advisors at ILA Partners. But you actually had their assessment done and their rating done, on your company, and you achieved the highest score in the history of the certification. And this is an independent certification that measures, how impactful you are as an entity, right? How important is to do this for companies, you think, and to start with?
So there are two answers to this as well. Let me start with where we left off, which is talking about reports and accounts. So one of the ways in which one is assured, and there's been some discussion on this, or in theory, an investor is assured that the accounts are true and fair reflection, is to have an auditor audit them. There have been some questions about auditors recently, but in general, that is the safety measure. That is the way that you ensure that the truth is being said. And I think companies should also be audited for what they say, particularly now. So everybody now says that the ESG and impactful and integrated. Okay, who audits it? Because I can start a company and say we're the most impactful ESG integrated, and I can have really nice websites. So the importance of an independent audit for the consumer, for the underlying beneficiary whose money is going to be used, is deeply important. But equally, it's important for us who actually use the service, because unless you go into self-reflection and unless you try to work out where you're weak and where you're strong, you can't move forward. Now, we were incredibly proud and pleased that we were chosen with such a high rating. We really were. And it was an amazing boost for us, and we're very thankful for it, but we're not sitting on our laurels. We're very humbled by it. But in a way, we want to keep on testing ourselves, because we do this because we believe it's the best way of doing what we do. And we need to check ourselves to make sure that we're constantly improving what we do. So that's why it's also important for business reasons, and as well as for the client or the underlying beneficiary.
Excellent. And I do recommend people to go and look at the report. I will add the link to the notes of the podcast. But in essence, it does look at different areas in terms of how you perform, how you're perceived, by externally, how you integrate ESG. So it's quite a few areas that it reviews, so that there is this independent third party view of how you behave effectively, right?
Exactly.
And yes, as we mentioned, you happen to receive the highest rating, and they have done this on a few entities. You can do it at whole entity level, and then you can do it also sometimes at just fund specific levels, which is an option that you can have. But anyway, congratulations, and it's nice to see that being you kind of through engagement and through your services, sometimes being the third party, and working with others to make them better, that you also take action to work with third parties to check that you're doing the right thing.
Exactly, and as I say, we're very, very pleased and grateful for the rating, and we will continue to try to improve ourselves. It humbles us.
Very nice. So now, as we are trying to start wrapping up the conversation, how do we scale sustainable investing? How do we transition more capital? We still need to fund some sectors. We still have, and we didn't talk about this, but you were a participant in with Mark Campanale, pushing the agenda around carbon tracking and the thesis of that we're completely overinvested and we're never going to get all the resources out. And then at the same time, we still don't have in the pipeline companies or maybe enough supplementary or products and services and companies that can replace the ones that we have today. So it's so complex, right? And people and now understand people can, without understanding the whole spectrum and how the whole supply chains and all the stakeholders, so easy to point the finger and say, you're getting the top rating, but you're still, investing in stranded assets.
Let me start with the carbon investments and then work backwards, because actually it exemplifies the issue. So, and for a while I was the chairman, by the way, of Carbon Tracker, which is Campanelli's outfit, and I was involved with the Vatican's bringing together the captains of all the oil majors to come to this agreement about pricing carbon that happened in the Vatican last summer, not this summer, the one before. So what is it that we're trying to do? So you can take two positions. I'm describing not passing a value judgment. One position is to say, global warming is a clear and imminent danger. I will personally not buy that share because it has carbon assets. The problem is, we start off by talking about indexation. The company exists and is still producing carbon. So what you're doing is you're feeling good about yourself. I'm doing the right thing, but actually you're not solving the problem. To solve the problem, you need to do three things. One, you need to convince the company to either close down or change its business model. Two, you need to find an alternative source of whatever the company does. Mm-hmm. And three, you've got to convince the consumer to actually shift their consumer patterns. And all three are necessary if you're really trying to change the final outcome. One on its own is not going to work. So if we do own fossil fuel companies, generally speaking, we tend to own and encourage ones that shift from oil to gas. Now, gas is still burning carbon, but it's cleaner than oil. And we're encouraging them to go from gas to other, be it solar, be it wind, be it any other. That's one. And at the same time, we're encouraging manufacturers of cars to move to EV cars, because that is a cleaner way of work. But that's only part of the problem. You've only changed one bit. We work and advocate with the regulators to make city centers, and you've seen this increasingly in Europe, here in the UK, more EV focused, more pedestrian focused, less fossil fuel car focused. Okay, so you've dealt with that. You still haven't dealt with the rest of it. You have the whole thing about, for example, fast fashion. Fast fashion eats up a huge amount of carbon emissions, right?
Yeah, and water, yeah.
There's a whole thing of a discussion with consumers about how to change consumer behavior. And we started again this conversation saying, through our savings, we impact the world that we live in by what we buy. Well, actually, we do also by our spending patterns.
Right. Yeah.
We should question ourselves and our neighbors. So what we do is advocate. If you look at our pledge, our oath, by the way, it says, I would advocate. That's what we do. So do you, if you drive, do you bicycle? If you don't bicycle, do you drive an electric car? Why not? Right? I mean, that's the first bit of advocating. Do you look at where your clothes are made? Are you sure that they're low impact rather than high carbon impact clothing? Carbon emissions from global trade is actually quite massive. Now, it turns out if you have manufacturing facilities in each region, actually you bring this down somewhat. How much are we working on it? And how much are we investing in alternative visions and technologies? You've got to do all of these things to move the dial. So we're not interested in virtue signaling. Virtue signaling is great, but actually we're interested in something more. In this, and forgive me, this is going on a personal level. I bring something from my own faith. So I'm a Muslim, and Muslims have, like Christians, like Jews, like others, and Hindus, we have various practices. But we say in our faith that fasting is the practice that matters the most. And the reason is this, that if you go to the mosque or the church, people see you, right? So I'm a good churchgoer. I go to the synagogue every Saturday. My community sees me. But actually, I can say to you, I'm fasting, but I could be drinking my Coke. Nobody sees me. There's no virtue signaling in it.
Yeah.
You do it to itself. And to my mind, trying to change things is about change, not about virtue signaling. So that's the first point. The other point is change happens over time. It doesn't happen suddenly. You reach a tipping point and then the tipping point goes. When Campanelli started, I remember going to the Bank of England and meeting with Mr. Andrew Haldane, who I have a huge amount of respect and time for, huge amount. And he understood what we were saying, but in our first meeting, he wasn't convinced it was a financial matter. He thought it was much more a societal matter. Now, he looked at it and he's changed his mind, and he's moved markets to change their mind. If you look at responsible investing, Professor K has moved to a position which is close to what we believe in. So what's happening? What's happening is that actually we're beginning to have societal movement. And if you look at generations, the younger generation, not my age, but my daughter's ages, are much more concerned about these issues of fast fashion versus not fast fashion and making a change with their consumer behaviors. And meat versus not meat. I mean, again, meat is a big reason why we have carbon. And suddenly you have a societal move. So to change things, you need it all to come together. And this idea that you can just do it by saying, oh, we'll solve the problem by producing a better battery for electric cars, or that's just one of it. But you've got to do it all. And you've got to realize it's a long, long slog.
Yes.
The good thing is, as a society, COVID has taught us that when these events happen, when these extreme events happen, they can wax society in a major way. So suddenly people are getting more worried because we've seen what COVID did to us. We all had to lock ourselves out in our houses. The changing pattern of weather is beginning to worry people now. Insurance companies are beginning to worry about insuring buildings and businesses next to waterways and next to the seas. And people are beginning to openly talk about, if we don't do something about this, then there will be entire cities that disappear underwater. I mean, if this is unmitigated and we end up at 3 degrees, there are some projections that show cities as varied as Alexandria in Egypt and New York, which loses a big chunk of it to the sea. Right? And why should we care? Because we can always build other cities. We should care because it impacts our lives. Do you remember I went to Adam Smith to think of this? Why in Europe particularly we should care? Next to us is North Africa. And North Africa is full of very young people. And right now, North Africa is at the precarious tilt of being able to feed itself. And same with the whole of Africa. We saw the massive migration that happened to Europe. And look at the destruction it did and the disruption it caused. Now, if we have water rising, if we have 2 degrees, then the Delta region in Egypt gets flooded. There's 100 million people who live in that country. And they're not going to have enough food. We saw what happened when the lakes in Central Africa dried up and the migration that came up to North Africa and then through that to the rest of Europe. It is in our interest on all levels to actually deal with this danger. The problem has always been it's long term, and people have delayed trying to deal with it.
Yeah.
Or they want a solution which is a one pill solution. You do this and it's solved. That's not how the world works. You've got to do a little bit at a time. That's what we believe in. Little changes at a time that make sense to everybody, and you've got to be long term. The good thing about COVID is it showed you if you don't do something, actually the results can be pretty harsh.